So this is video 2 of the first chapter. We talked a little bit about the formation of the characteristics of the oceans rather than the formation. Now we're going to talk about exploration of the oceans. And you probably learned a lot about the European exploration of the oceans as part of your history classes. We're going to go a little farther back than that. So the earliest explorers weren't even really explorers. They were really looking for fishing grounds or trade. We know from archaeology that boats have existed for over 40,000 years, so people have been getting out in the ocean for at least that long. And the oceans themselves have facilitated trade, interconnection cultures, and functionally it's moved people around the planet. This ability to navigate the ocean and go places. The earliest explorers we're going to talk about are... Oh, there we go. Sorry, slide didn't move. Are the Pacific navigators. We don't have a lot of information about them because they didn't have written history and they have more of an oral tradition. But through some archaeology and now the power of genetics, we have been able to, or I guess science has been able to, sort of piece together how this happened. Now, this was really confusing for people. You know from biology that people evolved in Africa and then moved around the planet. Well, then how did they get to all these little islands? So you know, if you've ever looked at a map, basically going from Asia, spreading across the Pacific and getting more and more spread out are the islands we call Micronesia, Melanesia, Polynesia, and include some great vacation places. Everybody loves Hawaii. We now know that, you know, in that 20 to 40,000 year mark, that people migrated from Asia throughout Micronesia to Polynesia and as far as Easter Island. They did these in really primitive boats, like outrigger canoes are sort of the more modern version of them. And it's sort of miraculous if you think about this. These people traveled thousands of miles, and given the nature of the ocean, especially in this area, the fact that they made it to all these places is somewhat phenomenal. You know, the distances traveled were in some cases thousands of miles. This is an example of I have to do it again. This is an example of what's called a stick chart, and people would make these for themselves. So like a family would guard these things very carefully, and only they knew how to read them. But basically, and this is a remade one. This is not a historic one, but they do have historic ones. And these stick charts would use the waves, currents, and even the presence of animals, birds, turtles, and so on, for people to be able to know where they were in an ocean that was very large compared to the, you know, islands in it. And they were able to make really, really long distances. So we know that now. Now, genetics was finally the nail in the coffin that proved that the Pacific people came from Southeast Asia, primarily. Ironically, also the people of Madagascar, not actually African. Genetically, they're descendants of the people from the same group. But there was some debate for a while that it was possible that the people, especially of Easter Island, which is thousands of miles away from any of the other islands, could have gotten there from South America. And in order, before we did genetics, this guy named Thor Heyerdahl built a raft. Yeah, I know he's like got a Norwegian name, whatever. And he sailed that raft using currents and wind and so forth to the Easter Islands from Chile. And that voyage was called the Kon-Tiki. And it was supposed to prove that, you know, even using primitive equipment, it was possible to navigate to these remote islands. So even though we now know that people didn't come from South America, it still supports the idea that people were able to travel long distances on what we would now consider primitive equipment. In Europe, the very first explorers were the Phoenicians, and if I spelled this wrong, I apologize. We're asking for a little history lesson from an oceanographer. The Phoenicians, they got around in terms of their exploration of the Mediterranean. They really explored the Mediterranean. They were the masters of trade at the time. They made it out into the Indian Ocean, which is kind of impressive. No canals back then. They explored the Red Sea. They even made it to the British Isles, which I'm sure you know, means they navigated the Straits of Gibraltar, which are a navigation hazard even today. They even circumnavigated Africa well before any of the European guys thought they made it there first. So the Phoenicians really did quite a few phenomenal things in terms of navigation. They also made maps, which was really nice. Thanks, Phoenicians, so we knew where we were going. After the Phoenician Empire had sort of crumbled, the Greeks started doing stuff, and I'm sorry, my picture's kind of on top of the words. Pytheas. Pytheas was the first person who used what we would call modern navigation, and that's what this picture of. This picture is not in your book, but I'm sure you've seen this in naval science. Basically, he made what we would call an astrolabe, or whatever. Basically, he was able to calculate your place on the planet in terms of how far you are off of the equator, using the North Star. And this was revolutionary. This meant no matter where you were on Earth, you could know your latitude. And remember, latitude is just the flat stuff, right? You could know latitude just by measuring where the North Star is, where you are, and finding that angle. And that angle would be equivalent to your latitude. So that was really revolutionary, and we still use, most sailors are trained how to do that to this day. In the South Pole, we use a different constellation. We use a Southern Cross, but it serves the same function. Oop, I jump back. Stop jumping around. We good? And more things missing. And also Greek was Eratosthenes. I'm not going to make you pronounce that because I can't. He determines the Earth's circumference, which is really important because if you know your latitude and you know how big around it is, you can get back to where you started, hypothetically. So between these two things, the only thing we were really missing in terms of modern navigation was longitude, because at the time they did not have any way to tell how far, these ones were, the this ways. Oh, slides are jumping around. Hold on one sec. All right, I think I'm back. So, longitude were this way. It wasn't until way later that we're talking almost 2,000 years later that they were able to determine longitude, and that will be an English guy. Other people, Herodotus produced this world map, which sort of had the center of the Earth as being the Mediterranean, which just kind of makes sense if you think about what people did. And then Ptolemy. Ptolemy's a really famous philosopher, but one of the things he's sort of infamous for, in a bad way, is that he updated Eratosthenes' calculations for the circumference of the Earth, but wrong. He had the Earth as being nearly a third smaller around than it actually was. And because of this, widely accepted, because Ptolemy was so famous, circumference of the Earth, it's one of the reasons why Christopher Columbus thought he was in Asia and didn't know he was like somewhere else. It's not completely Chris's fault. He didn't, have a good estimate of how far he needed to go. In the Middle Ages, the dominant navigators in the Med were Arabs. They were incredible traders. Also brought mathematics everywhere. Thank you to the Arabic culture. They traveled throughout East Asia, Africa, India, and even Europe. They also were sort of unique. They learned to use weather conditions for travel. So they would time their explorations as well as their trading missions to utilize the monsoon winds. Monsoon winds are very strong, and they actually switch direction. When they travel in one direction during monsoon season and in the opposite direction during the dry season. So they would time those travel explorations to take advantage of that so they weren't hopelessly going in one direction. If you know a little bit about your Columbus's history, we had some issues. We knew the winds would take us, towards the Americas or Asia, as he thought he was in. But coming back was an issue until they found the trade winds. Later in the Middle Ages, the Vikings, you probably heard about some of these guys, like Leif Erikson, the son of Eric the Red. They were the first people to explore North America. We know that they had settlements in Iceland and Greenland. We know that they made it to Newfoundland. There were issues with the mini ice ages of historical times that caused them to abandon those, but Vikings were the first people to make it to what we would consider North America. These are their routes, and you can see that they actually were heavily exploring these areas for like 150 years nearly. So, kind of interesting. We have Eric the Red on there. He kind of got around. And then the ones who made it far to the south were these, I'm not going to try, in the blue and the green. They made it to what we would call Newfoundland. We're actually going to stop this one here. We'll do the more traditional exploration ones in the next video.